Thank you, David. So my name is Dr. Sohail Gandhi. I am a family physician, and for the past 24 years, it's been my absolute privilege to provide comprehensive family practice care to the residents of Stayner, Ontario. I'm also a member of the section of General and Family Practice Executive, which is a section of the OMA. And it is my responsibility, and Kulvinder has asked me to talk about what will happen if this deal does become approved. And some of you will ask, well, how are you going to predict the future, or how can anyone predict the future? To which I reply that there is a very wise man by the name of George Santayana. And George Santayana is famous for saying, those who do not remember the past are condemned to repeat it. And so I say to you that this agreement harkens back to a previous agreement. Now let's talk about this particular agreement first. What this agreement provides for is something called a fixed PSB, a fixed physician services budget, which in essence says that there is a certain limit on the amount of services that physicians can provide every year for the next 4 years. This agreement also has what's referred to as a progressive discount on so-called high-billing physicians, and that is built into the agreement. And this agreement also talks about a physician human resources committee that will look into the physician manpower situation. And finally, this particular agreement enshrines $200 million in further cuts to be developed at a later date into the physician services budget. Now, if we harken back to 1994, the Ontario Medical Association of the day had an agreement cut with the then Bob Rae government. And guess what? That agreement put in place what was referred to as a hard cap on physician services, whereas now, of course, we're calling it a fixed budget. That agreement put into place something called threshold billings, where so-called high billers had their incomes clawed back, which now, of course, is referred to as a progressive discount in this current agreement. The 1994 agreement referred to a committee to develop efficiencies in the physician schedules of benefits. And of course, this particular agreement refers to a committee to develop what's called modernizations in the current schedule of benefits. And finally, the issue of physician human resources was actually completely ignored, including the disastrous medical school cutbacks of 1990. The OMA agreed to ignore that issue in that particular agreement of 1994, whereas this time, at the very least, they say, well, we'll have a committee and we'll study that. So we can see that this agreement parallels 1994. And what happened as a result of the 1994 agreement? Very simply, the physicians that were targeted at the time, and at the time, for some reason, it was the ear, nose, and throat doctors that seemed to be targeted. This year, of course, we're targeting the ophthalmologists, as per Dr. Hoskin's speeches about ophthalmology. And so what happened was that the so-called high-billing physicians, they were told they could only work a certain amount before they reached their threshold, so they worked the certain amount. Unfortunately, that didn't stop people from getting sick. People continue to get ill and need their services. And in my practice, what I saw in particular with the children was children who got recurrent ear infections and needed a procedure called a myringotomy, that's tubes in your ears to prevent that, wound up, after the decision was made that yes, you do qualify for tubes, they wound up waiting from 2 months to 6 months, to at one point they had to wait 9 months. And of course, in those 9 months waiting for their surgery, they kept coming to my office with recurrent infection after infection after infection. So I feel quite comfortable saying the same thing is going to happen to people who need cataract surgery or people who need retinal surgery with this agreement. We can say that the committee that was formed to find efficiencies in the schedule of benefits in 1994 did do its job. The Ontario Medical Association made a number of recommendations to the provincial government of the day. For example, one recommendation was, well, if a patient goes to see a specialist and needs a second opinion, that's okay. But if they're still not happy and want a third opinion, or say a fourth opinion or a fifth, is that something that should really be covered? That was just one of the recommendations. The politicians, of course, said, oh my goodness, if we make a recommendation like this, people will be up in arms. And so you can guess that they backed out of their agreement, but they held the physicians to their promise to cut back on the physician services budget. Physicians were rightly angered that the government had broken its promise, and that led to an exodus of physicians from our province, and it led to a situation where we had up to 3 million patients without a family physician in Ontario. The physicians' human resources crisis was ignored by the 1994 agreement. In this agreement, there is at least a committee But I would respectfully point out that Dr. Wally, who's the president of the OMA, in a statement to the Concerned Ontario Doctors Group, specifically referenced a physician's human resources document that said, and I quote, "There is a current oversupply of physicians," unquote, and that's from her statement to us. And yet we have a situation right now where there's 1 million patients in Ontario, almost 1 million, who don't have a family doctor. Now, as a physician, it is my responsibility to practice something called evidence-based medicine. That means that if I prescribe an antibiotic for a pneumonia, it has to be the right antibiotic. If I prescribe a high blood pressure medicine, it has to meet certain criteria based on good, solid, hard evidence. I submit to you that this agreement violates the principles of evidence-based politics. We know this type of agreement has failed in the past. We know it was a spectacular failure, and yet here we are. We've done that, and yet here we are, we're doing it again. So for that reason, and for the sake of my patients, I'm opposed to this agreement, and it's worthwhile noting that the section of General Family Practice could not see it to endorse that agreement as well.